Sylvester Stallone stepped quietly into the Lion's Table, a luxury restaurant nestled at the edge of Sunset Boulevard, still dressed in the worn costume from his latest film set. His coat was frayed, his boots dusty, and his beanie pulled low, shadowing his face. To most, he looked like a weathered drifter, someone who didn't belong in a place where the chandeliers dripped crystal, and every plate was a piece of art. He chose a table tucked into a quiet corner near the wall, hoping to go unnoticed, as the golden light from the hanging fixtures danced across polished wood and whispered wealth. But before he could even open the menu, a waiter approached with a sneer hidden beneath a forced smile. "Sir," he said, his voice laced with irony, loud enough for nearby patrons to hear, "are you certain you're in the right place?" His posture reeked of arrogance, as if the very sight of Stallone's clothes was an insult to the restaurant's brand. What happened next didn't just silence the dining room. It revealed a truth that would shift the entire atmosphere of the evening. The Lion's Table wasn't just another high-end dining establishment in Los Angeles. Perched among the city's trendiest addresses, it was a symbol of distinction. Its wide glass walls opened to views of slow-moving convertibles, neon signage from nearby theaters, and the endless hum of fame and ambition. Inside, every inch was curated, from the soft jazz echoing off the marble floors to the custom-made brass cutlery. This was where people came, not just to dine, but to be seen. Among the staff, none moved more confidently than Brian, a sharply dressed server in his late 20s, known for his charm with regulars and thinly veiled contempt for those who didn't meet his standards. To him, working here wasn't just a job. It was a performance, and every night was his stage. But behind that polished smile was a habit of quick judgment, an instinct to measure people by their appearance before they spoke a single word. So when a man dressed like a forgotten veteran stepped through the door, Brian didn't see a guest. He saw a problem. And the way he handled that moment would soon be watched, remembered, and forever change the way the Lion's Table served its name. On the corner of Sunset and La Cienega stood the Lion's Table, one of Los Angeles' most exclusive restaurants. With floor-to-ceiling windows, golden brass accents, and a massive chandelier visible from the street, it gave off an air of prestige that made people pause. Inside, couples sipped vintage wine, executives discussed deals in hushed tones, and waiters in tailored black uniforms glided across marble floors like well-trained dancers. At precisely 4:50 p.m., a figure appeared at the entrance, an older man, hunched slightly, dressed in a faded military-style coat that hung heavy on his shoulders. His pants were baggy and frayed at the hem, and his scuffed boots carried dust from an alleyway more than a red carpet. A beanie covered most of his head, and from beneath it peeked strands of gray hair and a scruffy beard. He walked slowly, but with a presence, quiet, grounded, not seeking attention, but somehow drawing it. He stepped through the revolving door and into the lobby, pausing just inside as if letting his eyes adjust to the warm golds and deep browns of the upscale interior. Behind the hostess stand, a young man named Brian stood adjusting the day's wine pairing cards. His hair was perfectly styled, and the name tag on his vest sat just right over his chest. Brian noticed the man immediately. His expression barely shifted, but his posture stiffened, his lips twitching with a mixture of confusion and irritation. The man did not belong here. That much, Brian decided instantly. He looked like he had wandered in from the street, possibly mistaking the restaurant for a shelter, or worse, trying to sneak in for a free meal. Brian approached, plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good evening, sir," he said in a rehearsed tone that sounded pleasant to most, but dismissive to those who'd heard it used before. "I believe you may be a little lost. We're a reservation-only establishment." The older man met his gaze with a calmness that made Brian pause for a fraction of a second. "I'm not lost," the man said gently. "I'd like to have a table, if that's all right." His voice was low and rough, but there was no desperation in it, no defensiveness, just quiet confidence. Brian raised a skeptical brow and tapped his iPad with exaggerated flair. "And do you happen to have a reservation, sir?" "Yes," the man said. "It's under Michael Carter." Brian typed it in, already certain the system would come up empty. And it did. He tilted the screen ever so slightly to show the man. "Unfortunately, Mr. Carter, I don't see anything under that name. Perhaps you've got the wrong restaurant?" The older man nodded slowly, still polite. "No, this is the place. I understand it's exclusive. I just hoped you might still seat me." Brian sighed lightly, clearly not in the mood to play along. "We do have a few tables open," he said, "but I'll have to seat you in a more appropriate area." He grabbed a menu and turned abruptly, walking briskly through the dining room without looking back. The older man followed without complaint. Heads turned as they passed. People weren't sure whether to pity or gawk. Finally, Brian led him to a small table in the far corner of the restaurant, right near the swinging kitchen doors, where the clang of pans and muffled voices spilled into the dining room. The lights didn't quite reach this part of the space, and the tablecloth was slightly wrinkled, unlike the others. "This should do just fine," Brian said, dropping the menu with a careless thud. "Nice and quiet. Private." The man sat down, adjusting his coat carefully and nodding. "Thank you." Brian turned sharply and left, muttering under his breath as he passed a server. He won't last past the first course. From across the room, a silver-haired woman watched with quiet intensity. Her name was Helen Montgomery, a retired high school literature teacher. She'd dined at the Lion's table before, usually on special occasions. She had a good eye for people, and she didn't like what she saw in Brian's tone. Not one bit. Meanwhile, the man at the back table picked up the menu and began to read it calmly. He wasn't flustered, wasn't in a hurry. He studied it the way someone reads a newspaper in the early morning, thorough, patient, intentional. A live pianist played in the corner, filling the air with the soft notes of autumn leaves. The scents of rosemary, sea salt, and roasted duck filled the room. After several minutes, Brian returned to take the order. "Have you made your selection, sir?" he asked, his voice sharp with forced professionalism. "Yes," the man replied. "I'll have the Wagyu filet, medium rare, and a glass of the 1997 Opus 1. Brian raised his eyebrows, struggling not to laugh. "Just so you know," he said with a smirk, "that wine alone is nearly $600 a glass. And the filet? Well, let's just say it's not a casual choice." The older man nodded once. "Yes, I'm aware." Brian scribbled down the order, chuckling under his breath as he walked away. At the server station, he whispered to a co-worker, "I give it 10 minutes. He'll panic when he sees the check." But the man didn't look panicked. He sipped the chilled water he'd been given, watched the pianist, and occasionally glanced around the room. Not judging, not anxious, just observing. A couple seated nearby whispered to each other. "He's not a regular here," the woman said. "But something about him, I don't know. He reminds me of someone." Maybe he's just a decent man, the husband replied. Too decent for that waiter, that's for sure. When the appetizer arrived, a foie gras torchon with cherry reduction, Brian dropped the plate just hard enough to startle. Enjoy, he said. Some people find it, acquired. The older man nodded. Thank you. It looks beautiful. He began eating slowly, appreciating each bite with a quiet satisfaction that didn't need to be spoken. Brian lingered, hoping to catch a grimace or a frown. There was none, just steady hands and a serene face. And those eyes, familiar in a way that began to gnaw at a few patrons who couldn't quite place them. 15 minutes later, Brian delayed the main course, choosing instead to deliver cocktails to another table and flirt with a pair of women celebrating a birthday. The steak sat under the warming lamp, losing its perfection. Finally, with exaggerated flair, Brian carried it across the room. Your filet, he said. Though, if it's not to your taste, I'm sure we could find something a bit more affordable. The man glanced at the dish. It looks excellent. Thank you. Just a reminder, Brian added, leaning in. Our tip policy is 20% minimum. That's standard here. Thank you for letting me know, the man replied. I'll be sure to remember. Back across the room, Helen leaned to her sister. Something's going to happen, she said softly. I can feel it. And she was right. Just as the man finished his steak and wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, the restaurant manager, a tall man with a strong jaw and salt and pepper hair, stepped out from the back. Richard Evans had been in the hospitality business for 30 years. He knew how to read a room, and the air tonight felt off. Whispers, glances, discomfort. He scanned the restaurant and then stopped cold. His eyes locked on the man at table 17. The color drained from his face. He rushed across the dining room, weaving between chairs, ignoring a waiting group at the door. He reached the table and froze. Mr. Stallone, he said quietly, as if saying it out loud might break the spell. I didn't know you were here tonight. The man looked up, eyes twinkling beneath the gray of the beard. The lines of his face now unmistakable. Sylvester Stallone gave a calm, tired smile. Good to see you, Richard, he said. The entire room went silent. Brian dropped the water pitcher he was holding. And Sylvester Stallone, still in costume, still covered in the dust of a movie set, looked at the young man and said, Now, let's talk about how we treat people. The silence inside the Lion's table was total. Even the pianist at the baby grand in the corner lifted her hands off the keys, fingers hovering mid-air, as if unsure whether the next note was appropriate. Every eye in the room fixed on the man in the corner, the man in the ragged coat, the man who had just been called Mr. Stallone. Brian stood frozen, a faint red coloring his ears and cheeks, his mouth slightly agape. Richard Evans, the seasoned manager, didn't waste another second. He lowered his voice, but leaned slightly towards Stallone, his tone urgent and apologetic. Mr. Stallone, I am so sorry. We had no idea. Had I known you were coming... Sylvester Stallone held up one hand, not harshly, but with finality. You weren't supposed to know, he said evenly. That's the reason I walked in like this. I wanted to see the place, not the show we put on for VIPs, but how it really runs. Richard nodded slowly, swallowing hard, understanding instantly what that meant. This wasn't a visit. It was an observation. Brian stumbled a step forward, flustered. I didn't know it was you, he stammered. Sir, I mean, you didn't say... Stallone turned his head and met Brian's gaze squarely. His voice was calm, but it carried the gravity of a man who'd lived through fights on and off the screen. You didn't ask, you assumed. That's the difference. Brian opened his mouth to respond, but quickly realized there was nothing he could say that wouldn't sound hollow. Stallone continued, his voice low but audible enough for the nearby tables to catch every word. I walked in off the street, dressed like someone you thought didn't belong. You judged me, insulted me, humiliated me, and not once did it occur to you that I might be someone with dignity. Brian dropped his eyes, fidgeting with the hem of his apron. The tension in the restaurant was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable in the traditional sense. It was sobering, the kind of silence that made people reflect, question themselves, and remember. Sylvester leaned back slightly in his chair. He looked around at the patrons, many of whom were now shifting in their seats. Some looked ashamed, others looked quietly moved. Helen Montgomery, still seated with her sister near the middle of the room, gave a small nod of respect in his direction. Her sister whispered, "I can't believe it's really him." "It's not about who he is," Helen said. "It's about how we all act when we think no one's watching." Richard spoke again, stepping closer to Brian. "I think you need to take a break," he said, his voice clipped, professional. "Go to the back, now." Brian hesitated, but under the weight of Stallone's eyes and the stares of half the restaurant, he turned and walked quickly toward the kitchen doors. Richard turned back to Stallone. "Mr. Stallone, would you like me to arrange a different table, a fresh meal? I'll have the chef come out personally." Stallone shook his head. "That's not what I want, Richard. I don't need a new meal. I want a conversation with the staff when dinner service ends." Richard nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely. I'll clear the schedule. And again, I'm so sorry for what happened." Stallone gave him a small smile, kind but tired. "Let's make sure it doesn't happen again." With that, the manager stepped away, giving the actor space. Slowly, the pianist resumed her melody, soft and tentative at first, like a whisper of music returning after a storm. Conversations picked back up, though quieter than before. Many diners glanced toward Stallone's table with curiosity or admiration, but no one interrupted him. He finished the last few sips of his wine and folded his napkin with care. He didn't leave immediately. He sat there, calm as ever, simply taking it all in. In the kitchen, Brian sat on a crate near the staff lockers, his hands trembling slightly. One of the line cooks, a guy named Javier, who'd been working there for years, leaned against the wall nearby. "You all right, man?" Brian shook his head. I didn't know it was him," Javier replied without judgment. "You didn't have to know it was him. That's the point, isn't it? Would you have treated him different if he was just a regular guy?" Brian didn't answer. He knew the truth, and the truth hurt. Meanwhile, back in the dining room, the atmosphere began to settle. Helen stopped a passing waiter and asked, "Is he really the owner?" The waiter nodded. "One of them. Helped launch the place last year. But he's never announced it. Just wanted to be silent, partner. Said he wanted it to feel like home." Helen smiled. Then tonight, he did exactly what a good homeowner does. Check in when no one's expecting. By 9:15, the last of the entrees had been served. The tables began to clear as guests wrapped up their meals. Several stopped to glance at Stallone on their way out, some offering small nods of acknowledgement, one even whispering, "Thank you," though it wasn't clear for what. Perhaps it was for the reminder, for the lesson. For not walking out or making a scene, but instead choosing dignity. At 10 o'clock, after the final table was cleared, Richard gathered the entire staff in the main dining room. Waiters, hosts, bartenders, cooks, even dishwashers emerged from the back, lining up in rows by the now dimmed chandelier. Sylvester Stallone stood at the center, still in his weathered coat, still looking every bit the man who'd been judged only hours earlier. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold. He looked each person in the eye, one by one, before speaking. "We all make mistakes," he began. "That's part of being human. But tonight wasn't just a mistake in service. It was a failure in empathy. I came in here looking like someone who didn't matter. I did that on purpose. Because I wanted to see how we treat people when we think they can't offer us anything in return. And what I saw was a lesson." The room was still. No one shifted. No one coughed. Stallone continued. "Some of you served with kindness. Some of you looked uncomfortable, but stayed quiet. And one of you treated me like I wasn't even worth a glass of water. That says something. Not just about this restaurant, but about the world we live in. We're too quick to judge, too fast to assume, too proud to see past appearances. But I want you to hear this. Greatness is never about how you treat people who can help you. It's how you treat those who can't." He paused, his gaze falling briefly on Brian, who stood at the back of the group, his head bowed. "Tonight I saw a restaurant with good bones. But if we're going to be great, truly great, it starts with how we treat the least impressive person who walks through those doors. Because you never know who they are. And more importantly, you never know who they might become." A soft murmur passed through the staff. Some nodded, a few teared up. Even the sous chef, a large man who rarely spoke, cleared his throat and looked away. Stallone stepped forward slightly. "Brian," he said. The young waiter looked up, startled. "Yes, sir?" Stallone didn't raise his voice. "You made mistakes tonight, but this isn't about punishing you. It's about what you do now, whether you grow, whether you learn, whether you become better." Brian swallowed hard. "I want to," he said, voice tight. "I really do." "Good," Stallone said simply. "Then prove it. Not to me, to yourself. Every shift, every guest, every time." Richard stepped in then. "We'll be conducting a new round of staff training next week, focused on inclusion, humility, and service. Not because of tonight, but because it's the right thing to do." Stallone nodded. "That's how we build a place people talk about, not just for the food or the decor, but because they feel something when they walk in, because they're treated like they matter." The staff began to disperse, quieter than usual, reflective. Some thanked Stallone. Others simply nodded and went back to their stations. And Sylvester, still dressed like a forgotten man from a forgotten street, made his way to the door. He paused beneath the golden sconce near the exit, looked over his shoulder once, and said, more to himself than anyone else, "Funny how the smallest moments end up teaching the biggest lessons." Then he stepped out into the cool night air of Sunset Boulevard, the city buzzing around him, the streetlights casting long shadows behind the man everyone had judged too quickly. The night air outside the Lion's Table wrapped around Sylvester Stallone like a gentle reminder of everything that had just unfolded. He stood still for a moment on the sidewalk, looking down the familiar stretch of Sunset Boulevard where city lights shimmered against chrome bumpers and glass towers. From the outside, the restaurant looked just like it always had, elegant, warm, full of life. But inside, something had shifted. Not just in the air, not just in the staff, but deep in the culture that had quietly crept into the corners when no one was paying attention. Stallone pulled his coat tighter around his frame and walked down the street, disappearing into the Friday night hum of Los Angeles. Inside the restaurant, the staff began to clean in a silence that wasn't awkward, but reflective. Brian moved slowly through the dining room, collecting linen napkins and setting silverware straight, his hands a bit more careful than they had been earlier that day. He still heard the words ringing in his ears. You didn't have to know it was him. That's the point. And he knew they weren't just about Sylvester Stallone. They were about everyone who ever walked through those doors. A man in a tattered coat, a woman in work scrubs, a couple celebrating with what little they had. He thought of the night 2 weeks ago, when a teenage boy, in worn sneakers, came in with his grandmother. He'd turned them away at the door, saying they didn't meet the dress code. The boy had just wanted to celebrate making honor roll. That memory now stung in a way he hadn't allowed it to before. In the days that followed, the story began to quietly circulate. Not through press releases or social media blasts. Stallone had no interest in publicity, but in whispers between regulars, in conversations between servers, in emails passed along from one staff training session to another. Did you hear what happened Friday? He came in dressed like a homeless man, and they almost kicked him out. No, not almost. They actually gave him the worst table and mocked him. And then he revealed who he was. But the wild thing is, he didn't yell. He didn't fire anyone. He just talked. The story traveled because it mattered. Not for its drama, but for its meaning. On Monday afternoon, Stallone returned to the restaurant, not as a guest, not in disguise, but in his usual jeans and black leather jacket. He walked through the front door and nodded at Richard, who was standing at the host desk, clipboard in hand. Richard greeted him with a respectful smile. Afternoon, Mr. Stallone. Welcome back. Just here to sit in on the staff meeting, Stallone said, his voice as grounded as ever. Thought it might help if I shared a few things. Richard nodded, already informed. We've got everyone assembled in the private lounge. When Stallone walked into the back room, the staff looked up. Servers, hosts, bartenders, kitchen crew, even the dishwashers. Brian was there too, seated near the middle, his posture straighter than usual, hands folded tightly in his lap. The room wasn't tense. It was open, expectant. Stallone stood at the front and leaned slightly on the chair beside him. He didn't hold notes. He didn't clear his throat. He just started speaking, like a father addressing his grown children, not with judgment, but with care. I grew up in neighborhoods where people didn't have much, he began. Philly in the 60s wasn't exactly the red carpet. I've seen people fight to be heard, to be seen, to be treated like they mattered, even for a moment. And I remember that. I carry it with me. When I walk into a place, I don't need attention. I don't need special treatment. But I do notice how people treat those they think don't matter, because that tells me everything. His voice was calm, but it gripped every person in the room. You don't need to know someone's name, their income, or what car they drive to show them basic decency. You just need to look them in the eye and treat them like a person. He paused, and for a moment, no one even shifted in their seat. When I walked in here the other night, I knew I looked out of place. That was intentional. I wanted to see how this place, the one with my name tied to it, my values invested in it, would respond to someone who had no obvious value to give. Some of you passed that test without even knowing you were being tested. Some of you didn't, and that's okay if you learn from it. Brian raised his hand slightly, unsure if he should. Stallone nodded toward him. Brian stood, his voice hesitant but clear. "I didn't pass the test," he said, "and I'm sorry. I wasn't just rude. I was arrogant. I thought I was protecting the restaurant's image, but I was really just protecting my own bias." He exhaled slowly, eyes meeting Stallone's. "I've been thinking about it every day since, and I just want to say thank you for not yelling, for giving me a chance to do better." Stallone offered a gentle smile. "You don't owe me that thanks, Brian. You owe it to yourself. Every time you treat someone better than you did before, you win back a piece of who you really are." The room remained still, moved not just by what was being said, but by the raw sincerity of it all. Over the next hour, the meeting turned into a conversation. Staff members shared stories of moments they felt ashamed of how they'd treated someone, or proud of a time they didn't judge a book by its cover. It became something more than a lesson. It became a shift in culture. From that week forward, the Lions Table quietly updated its staff policy. They added an extra line to the employee handbook under Guest Experience. It read, "Every guest deserves dignity, regardless of appearance, regardless of status, every single one." The restaurant began hosting monthly team reflections, where servers and kitchen staff could talk freely about challenges, stories, and lessons learned. It wasn't perfect overnight, but it was different, more human, more conscious. Helen Montgomery returned the next month, this time with her grandson. She sat in a booth near the window and smiled at the young hostess who welcomed them with warmth. "Do you remember me?" Helen asked. The girl hesitated. "From the night Mr. Stallone came in?" Helen nodded. "Yes, I saw how much changed after that." The hostess smiled and said, "It's changed a lot more than people think, and it's better now, for everyone." As for Stallone, he continued his life as usual, filming, writing, giving speeches here and there. But when people brought up the story, because inevitably it found its way onto blogs and late-night talk shows, he'd just shrug and say, "It wasn't about me, it never was. It was about how we treat people when we think no one's watching." The last time he visited the Lions Table, it was just before closing. No cameras, no entourage. He walked in wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, greeted by a young server who didn't recognize him right away, but treated him with kindness anyway. He smiled to himself, knowing that was the real reward. Not recognition, not fame, but the quiet knowledge that, sometimes, a lesson learned in silence changes more than a lesson shouted from a mountaintop. As he left that night, walking past the gold-lettered sign above the entrance, he looked up and paused. The lights of Los Angeles blinked around him, and for a moment he stood still, breathing in the cool Pacific breeze. He didn't say anything, didn't wave, didn't look back, but in the subtle smile on his face was the message that needed no words. In a world obsessed with appearances, the most powerful thing you can do is choose kindness anyway. Not because someone might be important, but because everyone already is.